Greetings, traveler. Have you ever been in a situation where you're trying to conduct a D&D game with first-time players, and no matter what you do, they never seem to be engaged, they never seem to be enjoying the game? I certainly have found myself in this situation before, and no matter how much I tried playing D&D campaigns from published material or from my own original campaigns, nothing seemed to catch their attention, and the players seemed bored and unengaged with the game. But then I tried this new way of approaching this situation, and it worked like night and day. I managed to get them interested, I managed to get them engaged, and more importantly, I managed to get them participating and being this huge part of the fun that a D&D game is. So today what I want to do is talk about how I applied this in my campaigns, what the results were, and then give you a simple framework for thinking about this and then hopefully apply it in your campaigns as well. My name is Xanthos. I've been working in the games industry for over 13 years now, and I've been playing Dungeons and Dragons for almost double that. And I noticed that playing with people who were familiar with role-playing or fantasy games or fantasy itself was the easier version of playing D&D, since they sort of knew kind of what to expect. But playing with people who had no contact with fantasy, role-playing, or video games or anything like that was a much higher challenge, because they seemed to almost instantly disconnect from the story and the world of the D&D game, and they would stay that way until they basically had to go back home after the session ended. People like that were usually someone's friend who's coming to the game for the first time, someone's girlfriend, someone's boyfriend who's joining for the game, relatives, people who are not really there in because they love the game so much, but because either they've been brought there by somebody else, or they're simply curious about Dungeons and Dragons and they want to give it a try, but they don't actually know anything about it. So no matter how much I tried to role play the published material that I found, or uh, craft my own adventures for basically trying to get them to engage with it, that didn't seem to get their interest. They couldn't seem to engage with it. But then I thought, well, surely even if someone has never played D&D or doesn't know anything about fantasy, so to speak, they still watch movies, they still read books, they still like stories, right? Everybody does. It's in our human DNA to like stories and to find them interesting, as long as they are relevant, of course, to our lives. So I thought, well, what if I, instead of trying to bring out the best of a published adventure that I found or something that I would usually write, what if instead I tried to find what they're interested in and what they like? And with this particular group, it was one player who actually was two players who had heard of Dungeons and Dragons before, but they didn't know anything more past that. They were just curious about what it is and how you play it. And the third player was the girlfriend of one of those two guys who absolutely knew nothing about any of that stuff, including D&D itself. So talking to them, I felt that definitely engaging the girlfriend of one guy would be key to this, because of course, if she didn't enjoy the game, the whole group would fall apart and they wouldn't want to continue. But also for the other two guys, since they didn't really know anything about how the game is played, I would have to present it in a way that's very easy to understand, very close to what they know already, and kind of hint about what their next step or what their participation in the game should look like. So after talking to all three of them, I found out that they like fantasy in the classic way, in the fairy tale type of way, something like the story of King Arthur. So I thought, well, that's not the type of story that I would typically choose to role play in my campaigns, but perhaps this would be good to engage them, and it was a fun experiment for me to try. So what I did was I set the stage for this new campaign before explaining anything about rules and dice and so on, just to give them the setting and to show an environment that they would understand easily and they would hopefully find approachable. And I said that you find yourself, yourselves in this magical kingdom. I went ahead to describe the kingdom in a way that was very close to the story of King Arthur and his quest for the Excalibur. And I said that eventually the group finds itself in a scene where they're all before the Excalibur stuck in the rock. And there, I started describing each of the individual characters. So at this point, the players have not created a character, they don't know anything about dice rolls. They know they're supposed to come in the game eventually, but they don't know how. They don't know who their character is and so on. This was really for me a test to see if I can engage somebody who really knows nothing about the workings of D&D. So I said before the sword stands a group, and I started describing all of the characters. I described a knight character, an archer character, a thief roguish type character, and a wizardish kind of character. And of course, these are 4 characters, and we only have 3 players in this situation. So I said, which of these characters, I described them, of course, in more detail, and I said, which one of these characters would you like to, would you find more interesting? Would you like to control for this part? And they all went and picked whoever seemed interesting for them. And here, notice how the point where this cast of characters is diverse in nature, so hopefully at least one of them, each of them would find more approachable. And then for the next part, I left it up to them to choose what they would do from that point on. So notice how the sword is still in the rock, and they know that there's a knight type character there, but the other characters are not like that. So it was up to them to decide if one of the non-knight characters would try to pull out the sword and see what happens, or if they would leave it up to the knight who fits the fairy tale more closely. So the interesting thing here is that without me telling them that the knight had to do it or whatever anyone had to do, the knight character instinctively stepped forward and pulled the Excalibur out of the rock, which was cool because I didn't have to tell them what to do. I didn't have to tell them what the story is about or what they're supposed to be doing or what the great mystery is here that they have to solve or the adventure. I didn't have to say anything about that. But because they all had the internal image of the fairy tale in their minds, they sort of had an intuitive understanding by knowing the legend of what's supposed to happen next. And from then on, they knew, without me having to say anything, that they're basically role-playing out this fairy tale. And here was another important thing. They also knew that they could basically say whatever they want, they could do whatever they want, they could discuss between themselves about what to do next or what's the meaning of the sword or what it is all about. They could ask questions, but they had a very specific frame to think about this and to decide their next steps. And after they discovered that they don't have to stick to the original script, they don't have to roleplay the fairy tale exactly as the legend has it, that made them think in interesting ways. And even though none of them had ever played D&D before, they could instinctively imagine what sort of actions would be fun for them or they would want to explore in this type of situation that they more or less knew from outside of D&D. So by the end of the session, all of them were engaged, all of them were keen to tell me what their character is supposed to do, what they want to do next. They had questions for each other, they interacted with the NPCs, and basically they behaved as any seasoned D&D group, which was a very surprising, very positive thing for me to discover. And of course, needless to say, they wanted to play a second session and so on. So I tried this framework with several other first-time groups, and it has worked just as well. So what I want to do for you, Traveler, is break down this framework and go through exactly the steps that I went to build up to this situation. So hopefully, if you want to try it, you can do so as well. So I'll break it down to 3 steps. Step 1 is the research. Step 2 is the setting up of the campaign or the situation. And step 3 is how to set up the choices for the characters in a way that hopefully they will find interesting. So let's go with step 1. Step 1 is simply talking to the players as you would, I suppose, in any beginning of a new campaign, of a new group, and find out what they like, what their background interests are, what they find romantic or adventurous or cool and interesting and so on. And from talking to each one of the players, hopefully there is a common ground somewhere, some common themes, or if there isn't any common themes, then perhaps there's a chance to interweave these themes. So for example, if one character really likes romance type stories and another really likes dark horror stuff, then perhaps there's some space for some romance in this dark horror story. So coming up with the general area of where you can move in this adventure after you've spoken to the players is the first step in this process. The second step is to come up with a story that's well known enough specifically to that group of players that even if you didn't have to explain everything about it, players would typically know how it goes already. So good examples for this are Disney movies, legends, Hans Christian Andersen tales, old fables, fairy tales, popular movies in general. I don't know, like the Aliens movies, or I don't know, Jurassic Park, or any of the more popular names out there. Because even without you having to say anything, just by describing the situation, players would know what kind of situation they're in, and what's supposed to happen next, what's expected of them. This is important because in Dungeons and Dragons, we typically take a story like The Lord of the Rings, where there's a group and they have to go out and do this epic adventure. And we take that for granted. But it's very important because it gives us a frame of how to think of Dungeons and Dragons. So without anybody having to say it, we assume that the group will come together and they have to go out and do this great task or great quest. So in the case of this new group, having something that they already recognize does basically all of the heavy lifting that needs to be done for the players to feel immersed in the story. And once that happens and they know what story this is, what setting this is, then they already know at least what's supposed to happen next. And this brings us to step 3, which is that subtle, very subtle but super important step of realizing that they're not a slave to the story as it's supposed to happen. So they don't have to play this very rigid one-track story that has one direction and they cannot veer away from. So in the case of the King Arthur campaign that I played before, I described the setting in enough detail to show what sort of setting this is, to make it clear that this is basically the same as that fairy tale, same as that legend, but without naming specific things. So without saying that the sword is the Excalibur and the knight is King Arthur and the name of the kingdom is whatever that was supposed to be. So they know the setting, but there's no proof that this is the setting. So it walks like a duck. It doesn't sound like a duck, but you haven't heard what it sounds like, so you can kind of assume it's that kind of situation. And this is the key to step 3, to have the players understand that it's their choice whether they want to stick to the script and do and live out this great adventure as they know it already, or veer away from it and have their own adventure. So in the case of the King Arthur legend campaign, it might have been entirely possible for somebody else to pull out the sword. And then, if that had happened, players would want to know, well, is this okay for this to happen? And what are their precautions? And if anybody could pull the sword, why didn't they do so already? So many questions to be answered. as it played out, we didn't have to go down that route, but perhaps going down that route would be interesting to explore. So from that point on, now that players know the general setting, they know the general goal, and they know they have the freedom to affect the story in whatever way they want, then they're engaged, then they're empowered, then they're off to live their own adventure as they like it. And if the adventure ends early, or if after finishing the first goal, they want to go on and complete the rest of the quest, then of course they're going to be back for session 2 and so on. Sorry for my throat, Traveler. It always attacks me when I do these videos. I hope you don't mind. Sorry about that. So anyway, that's the general framework of this. The power of using what the player knows already is huge, because not just in video games, but in D&D, of course, and any other game as well that involves this type of role playing, because you don't have to explain it. If you say that the players see in front of them a camel, you don't have to explain what a camel is, because most people will know that. So you can take all this knowledge that's already pre-installed in the players' minds and basically use that as your starting point and start painting from there. Of course, that's not to say that you have to do it, but it's just an easy trick that I found to basically make our work easier. Anyway, I hope this helps at least one other person out there. I hope this is useful to you. If you have questions about this, I would be happy to take a look. And thank you so much for your time. As always, have fun.